Hello all. This is the Roundtable hosted by the Environment and Social Issues Cluster at Nickel and Dime, which is the official research platform for the Center of New Economic Studies, OP Jindal Global University. So today's discussion is about the annual World Economic Forum meet of 2023 that took place from 16th to 20th January at Davos. Now, interestingly, the theme of the year was cooperation in a fragmented world, and seeing how this forum is made for leaders from governments, businesses, and important civil society members, I think it becomes important for us to essentially see what are the issues that they are addressing. And so I'll just start with my first question over here. Building onto this, the energy security and decarbonization were much debated topics in the recent conference. Now, do you think there is like a steady investment into the renewable sources of energy? And along the same lines, do you think India in a place to like make policy interventions of the same?
Yeah, I think there has been a steady increase in investments into renewable sources of energy in recent years. This is mainly due to the need for energy security and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which has been one of the major investment drivers into renewable sources such as solar, wind, and hydropower. This trend is also expected to continue as countries transition away from fossil fuels towards cleaner, more sustainable sources of energy. Many countries are also setting renewable energy targets and implementing policies to incentivize the growth of the sector. This has resulted in a growing number of large scale renewable energy projects and the development of new technologies, which has further attracted investments into the sector. In India specifically, the government has taken several policy interventions to promote renewable energy, which include setting up renewable energy targets and implementing various financial incentives for the development of this sector. The country has also taken steps to modernize its electricity grid to better integrate renewable energy sources. But at the same time, I also think that the implementation of these policies and the pace of renewable energy development still face challenges, which is inadequate financing, regulatory hurdles, and slow progress in grid infrastructure. But I also think it is India has the potential to become a major investor in the global renewable energy market and making efforts to reach its goals.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with what you said. India and like the current government too has been making quite a bit of progress when it comes to like renewables. But as you mentioned, I think it becomes quite important whether the policies and schemes are actually being implemented in the proper scale as suggested in our the contribution targets that we've set for ourselves. And Rithini, do you have anything to add over here?
No, I think Sanjana put it very succinctly, and I agree with it fully.
Right. No, again, completely agreeing to that. And I think one of the major issues, I think I'll just build on to your point of it. I think one of the major issues that could come forward is how much exactly is India expected to invest, right? Because if we look at the numbers, India is kind of like at the forefront when it comes to the amount of greenhouse gases that we are emitting and the amount of reliance of carbon that we have. So I really do think it becomes important for India as a body, as a country, to kind of make the shift into renewables at a good pace, because the over reliance on carbon will have like detrimental effects in the future. So I think that's great. And now when it comes, we have talked about like energy security and decarbonization, but in the World Economic Forum, what they've started doing is that they have started including this open forum. And that's like another event format that allows like a broader audience to participate in the conference. And essentially this year, the unrepresented voices for climate justice took the center stage. Now, do you think despite all of that, this forum, the World Economic Forum, has adequate representation? And does that representation translate into impactful decisions for the said communities?
If I may go ahead, So this year, the open forum format, it did include some underrepresented voices, like refugees, indigenous people, disabled persons, all of those people were called, the representatives of those communities were called to speak their mind and, put forward their point of view, because those communities are the ones who are most overlooked when climate change policies are designed. And they suffer the most when it comes to climate change. For example, indigenous populations are they make up to about 5% of the world, but they conserve up to 80% of the world's biodiversity. This was a statistic presented at the WF this year, and they're most prone to sea level rise and extreme storms, etc. And there was also a representative of the he's a disability activist. He's a Swiss disability activist called Christoph Keller, and he argued that even though 15% of the world's population has some form of disability, the needs of the disabled people are not sufficiently considered when we prepare as a nation or as a world for a climate disaster or health disasters. And he put forward this idea of not just giving certain communities a place at a table that already exists, but in fact creating a new table for them all together to have open discussions and suggestions that would not have been considered at the original previous table. And there were also, even though an effort was made to bring in underrepresented voices in this year's WEF, there were multiple protest groups that had gathered. There were a lot of criticism still, because the WEF is a forum that is essentially a bunch of elite people coming together and discussing solutions to the world's most critical issues. And it's very hypocritical to some, because the people who come together and discuss these issues are the ones who profit the most off of environmental destruction and exploitation of cheap labor, etc. And for example, there was a members of this organization called Debt for Climate, which is like a global South-driven initiative. They essentially blockaded the entire private airport that was being used to transport the dignitaries and the people who attended the concert. So they called the usage of a private airport and private jets grotesque, and they called it shameless, because there were around hundreds of high emission private jets that attendees use to come to the conference, etc., while discussing the most critical issues when it comes to environment and climate. And most of the attendees still are, rich, white, privileged men, and they are discussing environmental issues and health issues, etc., that impact the rest of the world, but the rest of the world is not as represented. And there was also a lot of criticism about how it's like a cycle, it's a broken system where the people who are asked to come and speak their minds, people from underrepresented communities, they are invited, but their voices are not actually heard, in that it's just an informal discussion at the WEF and then no steps are taken after that. So yeah, I do feel that there was an effort this year with the open forum to bring in underrepresented voices, but it doesn't always translate into actual change.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything you said. And I think at the same time, it's also important to note that having representation is also only one aspect of the equation. The ultimate test of the WEF's impact is whether the decisions made and the outcomes achieved at the event lead to actual meaningful and positive change for these underrepresented communities.
Yes, I like completely agree with both of you. And I think when it comes to like conferences like WEF and like even COP, I think there's a kind of like fetishization of like climate change essentially. And like as rightly you mentioned, like these big leaders who essentially profit most of the climate change and are the contributors of climate change, right? They are the ones sitting in their ivory towers and like having these discussions when and even like when you look at the open forum format, right, it's like a separate format altogether. There it's also like a kind of exclusion from the main you could see the elite discussions that happen in WEF. And I think the elitism is pretty evident, and I think it is evident even when it comes to like the reporting of the event. Because if you, when I was just reading about it, it mentioned that, how some reporters, only very senior reporters are like allowed in, while rest are not even allowed to, like, look at the proceedings, because that is when like the most transparent and the most authentic conversations can happen, whatsoever they may be in that sense. So I think, yeah, it's really important that, I think it's a step, definitely, that they are finally like including some voices of the underrepresented communities in, even though it's like in a different format whatsoever. But I still think that, it is a step, but it definitely should, the conversation should be taken forward and like implemented adequately, I think. And also, now coming on to the third question, and this is pretty interesting because in the whole conference there was like a conversation on blue carbon. And so what exactly do you think blue carbon is, and what could be the reasons it was given such a limelight in this conference?
Blue carbon refers to the carbon that is stored and sequestered in coastal and marine ecosystems such as salt marshes, mangroves, and sea grass beds. These ecosystems play an important role in mitigating climate change by capturing and storing large amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. I think blue carbon was likely highlighted at this forum because of its significance as a potential solution to climate change. The protection and restoration of blue carbon ecosystems can help to reduce atmospheric carbon dioxide levels and contribute to global efforts to mitigate the impacts of climate change. I think additionally, also, blue carbon ecosystems provide a range of important ecosystem services, such as supporting fisheries, protecting coastlines from storms, and preserving biodiversity, making their preservation and restoration a high priority for many countries. Therefore, I think the recognition of the value of blue carbon for both climate change mitigation and ecosystem conservation makes it an important issue to highlight in a forum like the World Economic Forum.
Yes, definitely. I completely agree.
And
Yeah, Ritin, do you have
sorry.
anything to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it was also highlighted because I think there's been a recent deal that's been made with Indonesia, which is I think it's the leading it has the most blue carbon ecosystems in the world, and the WEF and Indonesia have signed a partnership to encourage and ramp up the nation's blue carbon efforts, and also to popularize blue carbon as an option that Sanjana just spoke about. So I think that's why it was highlighted as well. It's a very huge deal that's going to impact every sector, and there's a lot of stakeholders involved.
Yeah, I remember reading about the deal too, and I think that's why it's become at like such a forefront when WEF, because again, like you mentioned, there are like a lot of stakeholders involved. And I think when it comes to like blue carbon, uh, I think it's pretty important that it's been given like this recognition in the World Economic Forum, which is like a huge platform. And hopefully, yeah, like as Sajna mentioned, that it kind of like translate into a good climate mitigation and from an ecosystem perspective. Now, uh, then what's interesting again is that the World Economic Forum, right? They call this year, the 2023 year, the year of action. And as we discussed before, like, when it comes to the open forum, or when it comes to like energy security, decarbonization, uh, there's a lot of talk about wanting to invest into like renewable sources of energy when it comes to essentially disability inclusion too. And I think with the recent COP conference that happened, where they also again talked about the loss and damage fund that is to be implemented by making a committee. And I think it really becomes important that these discussions that take place in these conferences are not don't just remain discussions, and they kind of like translate into action. And I do believe that the action needs to be impactful and meaningful, mainly because it becomes skeptical because again, it's these leaders who contribute most to the climate change sitting here and discussing the same. And especially in World Economic Forum, when the reporting can also be biased, and when the reporting is also in a way censored because they're not exactly given into the actual conversations that take place. So we can hope that there is a scope for change in the coming year. And I think it's important to like keep an eye and keep a lookout on whether or not these discussions actually take place and implement uh, and that that are like implemented across. Sanjana or Mridin, do you have like anything more to add to it or like the overall discussion?
Yeah, I
Yeah, I think
totally.
like go
Sorry.
ahead.
I just have a small piece to say. I totally agree with what Archana just said, and I feel like one step that can be taken is to the general public, like conferences like the WEF, which are being held in this, like elite little ski resort town in Davos and stuff like that, are very inaccessible in that we don't relate to it in any sort of way. We don't see our voices. I mean, up until recently, we didn't see our voices being represented, the global south voices, the disabled community voices, the indigenous people voices. We didn't see those being represented. And in addition to that, the hypocrisy of using private jets or using and benefiting off of the exploitation of labor and the environment, etc. It all becomes very inaccessible, and it drives a greater wedge, I think, between the two halves, like people who are in control currently and the people who are impacted the most by climate change. So I feel like one step that can be taken is making it a little more accessible, in that, like Archisha said, the reporting and the where it is being held in the first place, and how accessible it is in the terms of how it's being portrayed in the media, and how sort of down to earth it is. I don't know if this is the right phrase to use, but it needs to be something that the general public can look at and understand, and it shouldn't be so inaccessible in its language and its approach and in its reporting, etc. is what I think.
Yes, I completely agree. Especially when you look at the location itself, right? Like I remember reading this one piece that, maybe the leaders have finally like realized that, climate change and global warming is real because, they won't be able to ski as well in the ski resorts because, of climate change and the snow not exactly accumulating there. So I think the down to earth is like completely important because, you need to take these conferences to the people, right? To the ones who are actually impacted by it, then, them sitting in their ski resorts and like going ahead. Sanjana, you wanted to say
I
something?
completely agree.
Mhm.
Yeah, like Nidhini pointed out, the fact that the WF is primarily attended by the world's most powerful and influential individuals, and the fact that these interests of these elites do not always align with the needs and priorities of the general public is definitely one of the critiques. But I think uh, the fact that it will be successful or not will depend on the willingness of its participants to prioritize the needs of the larger public and to collaborate effectively to bring about meaningful change in the end.
Definitely agree with you and like all the points that were like raised by both of you. And I think at this stage we can just hope that the 2023 year does really become a year of action, and we are essentially able to implement these ideas and make these conferences more accessible to the people and make sure their voices are heard more. So thank you so much for like joining me in today's roundtable conference, and let's just believe that let's just make these conferences more accessible to the people. Okay.
Thank you.